everybody has to work. Almost everybody has to work. And they spend so much of their life in work. It should be something they want to do. It should be someplace they want to go.
Tom Sterner is the founder and CEO of the Practicing Mind Institute, a successful entrepreneur, expert in present moment functioning. As a popular in-demand speaker and coach, Tom's worked with high-performance industry groups and individuals. These include athletes, coaches, CEOs, helping them free up to operate effectively in a high-stress situation so they can break through to new levels of mastery. He's the author of multiple books, international bestseller, The Practicing Mind, and Fully Engaged. Tom joined us way back on the podcast already, so he's a repeater. Jaime, when was he last on?
Episode 38.
38. I was like, what, 21? It's a while ago. World's changed.
Lots of things.
I think that the world's always changing. But just for some background, Tom's original book, who was on the podcast before, which you should go listen to, episode 38, The Practicing Mind. I talked to Tom a little bit because as we talk about the future of work, we got to talk about developing people. How do we create high-performance environments where we get the most out of the people around us? It starts with our people being in the right place at the beginning. And we talked about The Practicing Mind with Tom. Tom has come out with his latest book, It's Just a Thought, Emotional Freedom Through Deliberate Thinking. In this book, Tom outlines ways to first observe and then master your thinking. He does this phenomenally in this great read, a must pick up. So I wanted to catch up with Tom. Tom came in the office to talk to us about this one. Here's Tom Sterner. Let's bring it in. So Tom, you're not new to talking on the podcast.
Not at all. Not at all.
I have my notes from our last session. Tom was podcast number 6, Jaime. Well, let's not age ourselves. Here are some of the notes. So we talked about Practicing Mind, which was your first book in this series. We talked about practice versus learning. We talked about the difference between correct practice and incorrect practice. We talked about present moment functioning. We're not going to rehash the whole podcast, but I was excited to talk to you that time about the concept of practice and skill development. And you have your new book out. It's Just a Thought, Emotional Freedom Through Deliberate Thinking. So I guess jumping right in, why this book?
Well, when I wrote The Practicing Mind and then the second book, Fully Engaged, they were really about the process of understanding what correct practice is. And that really came down to centering on the process as opposed to being attached to the goal. It's Just a Thought. I spent 2 years researching that book, and it was really the culmination of exactly what is a thought. What is a thought? Where does it come from? Do we have any control over that? Are we basically just victims of a thought process that we're in, or can we make choices as to which thoughts we're going to have? And it took me quite a while to find that. It's a lot of based on neuroscience and psychology, but without a knowledge of where your thoughts come from, then you're basically just being thought. So that's what I tell people. You're either the thinker of the thought, or you're being thought by the thought. And that's what the book goes into, is understanding that and gaining the freedom and the power that comes from being in charge of the process.
I was reading the book through the lens of a person running a company and leading a team. What impact what hope did you have the impact of this book would have on maybe a reader like myself in the workforce with an organization? I guess what kind of impact were you hoping for?
Well, what I would like is for to understand the relationship between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind, and to understand that the subconscious mind is constantly recording. It's an elegant recording system. It doesn't think. It has no sense of humor. It's just listening to what you're saying and what you're feeling. It's really the feeling is the language of the subconscious, and then it records it. And then when a certain circumstance comes up that is similar to that, it goes onto the hard drive, if you can call it that, pulls that reaction off, plays it out, and then you experience it. Now, if you're not aware that that's going on, and this could be certainly infiltrate business decisions, how you interact with your employees, all these sorts of things. You know, like if you're not aware that's going on, then you're not actually creating your reaction to situations. And I think one of the biggest things for a person in your position is what I'll call authentic decision making. And what I find is that if you're not aware of this, then what is happening is that your subconscious is making the decisions for you. And you don't even know that that's happening. It feels normal. You've been doing it your whole life. And so you really have to get outside of that cycle to be able to be in control of exactly what are your decisions, where are they coming from, and what is their impact on the company.
You say in the book that you can't learn and perform at the same time. And that probably is the one I highlighted a bunch of stuff in the book, obviously, but that was one of the ones that I circled a bunch of times. I guess, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, you have to give yourself, when you're in the process of learning how to do something, you can't be focused on the score. If you use something like golf, when you go out on the golf course, if you want to be in a learning mode and you say like, well, look, I'm going to work on working the ball, then you can't be obsessed with what your score is, because you can't do both of them at the same time. You have to give yourself permission to be in learning mode. And then when you go out, if you want to perform, then you have to say, I'm no longer in learning mode now. Today I'm working on scoring. So when you're learning new skills, whether you're running a company or something else, you have to, when you know the mechanics that you have to go through, you have to put yourself in a position, you have to give yourself permission to be in a learning mode, which means you're going to make mistakes. You're going to have to excuse yourself. Excuse me. You're going to have to excuse yourself or feel comfortable being in that position. I think what happens is we become very attached to a certain performance level, which is not attainable when you're in a learning mode. And you also don't enjoy the process of learning because you're so attached to this level of performance. So I think you really have to make a conscious decision of which system are you on today? Are you learning or are you performing? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think as a coach, manager in a position with people, I think it's a profound concept, because it seems like let's pick restaurants, for example, right now in the hospitality industry. You have so much turnover. You talk to restaurant leaders and they're going to tell you something like, hey, there's a labor shortage. It's real tough to find people, which means that once they find them, in their minds, they got to get them. They're almost in performance right away. And they may not give people the space to be in learning mode. So that was where my mind jumped to, is how that would have a direct impact on a frontline manager who's thinking about, I have a new employee here. I want to get them ready and succeeding and successful. But if I'm always keeping them in performance mode, I mean, what happens if you're always trying to keep people in performing mode?
Well, if you try to keep them, you're going to fail, because there's a certain amount of time that has to, when you start out, they're learning a new skill. And when you start a new skill, you start at zero skill. And then you're on this linear line of mastery. So you can't start out at mastery. You have to start out at zero skill, and you have to recognize that. And so when you're trying to bring somebody on board, you have to recognize the fact that this is where they're at, and that their skill level will increase over time. But if you don't give them time to do that, then you're basically setting them up to fail, which is going to set you up to fail. Yeah.
The other thing you say in the book, that it's in the heart math section, which is an awesome. That was one of my favorite chapters.
Really?
There's a lot of really great stuff throughout, but this point that the heart sends 9 times more signals to the brain it's sticky, and it makes you really consider how emotions play a part in your day to day when you go to work.
Right. The heart has, it has its own form of nervous system, and it stores memories. And it would appear that what happens is that the heart creates the content for the thought. So the heart is really where the heart basically looks at the information, creates the reaction, then talks to the brain, and then the brain creates the thought to communicate it outward. So I think that's a really important thing to understand, because what it's saying is that we're really coming from a heart-centered position first. before we get to the brain. So when you look at it from that perspective, you have to deal with employees from that perspective, because that's how they're communicating. That's how they're receiving the information. That's how they're communicating this. They're communicating their understanding back to you.
So would you say, and I haven't thought about it this way, would you say that if you establish an environment where you can be in learning mode versus performance mode, and you're in learning mode, would you make the argument that it's about the heart connection if you were a manager working with your workforce to create the best environment, maybe
Absolutely.
even more so than the content?
Yeah, because what makes somebody want to work at a place? What makes them want to stay at a place? What makes them want to work for you? That's a heart connection. There are people that can perform, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily make good performers. Like, I can give you an example. That they have in pilot. As a pilot, there are people that have the athletic skills and the book skills to get a pilot's license and fly an airplane. But what they don't have is the decision skills. They make bad decisions. And that's an example of they can perform, but they end up putting themselves in bad positions because they don't make good decisions. So that, to me, that's kind of similar to that. Like, if you're excluding the heart perspective from the whole system of how do you get an employee from here to here, from raw start up to a high performance, you have to take in how do we learn, how do we take information in, and how do we process the information that's coming in. And that information, in fact, it's even being said that by the new science of consciousness, that consciousness is really centered more in the heart. The heart talks to the brain. So when you look at it like that, then you have to be basically thinking that way when you're making communications to your employees.
It makes you wonder, in a moment when all we're talking about now is ChatGPT and AI for the moment, all these things are going to take away all the repeatable tasks. It means that the human component, or the coach or the manager around the worker, technology can't replace the heart piece, can it?
No, absolutely not. And it's pure folly to think that. This is where that concept falls down to me, because there are some decisions need an emotional content behind them. They need some sort of an emotional perspective behind them. And that is not something that you're going to get from AI, even if it's simulated.
Yeah, you do a lot of interviews on this book. You've been kind of on a tour on it. And we were talking before we started about the questions you get. What's a question you don't get that you'd wish you got?
I wish that people would ask more about do I have responsibility for my thoughts? Because your thought energy is, and I do talk about this in the book, that what we're understanding now is that our thoughts are not our own. Our thoughts, the electromagnetic energy goes outside of our head. You're no more inside of your brain than you are inside of your laptop. Let's just say it that way. Your thought energy goes out. It goes out into the room. It goes out into the workspace. And so it's impacting everybody around there. And we can measure this. We can measure with HeartMath. There is energy that goes outside of the body, at least in an 8-foot sphere. And that energy has data in it. It has information in it, which is, how are you feeling? How do you think? All this sort of information. Are you angry? It's all in that sphere. And if you think about it, these bubbles all around everybody in a room full of people working, that energy is all intermingling with each other. And whether the success of the environment is going to be determined by how aware you are that even exists, and how you can utilize it, because you can utilize it as a strength, or you can be ignorant to it and be a victim of it.
What do you say to people that just say this is like, you're just talking about positive thinking?
Well, we're not talking about thinking, because we're talking about emotions, and feeling. And feeling comes, the thought is basically just an outline of what the feeling is going to be. So, and I would also say, this is all peer review science. We're not talking about, at this point in time in Western empirical science, like if you look at HeartMath, we're over 30 years into that research and continuing. So this is not like some new age science. It's stuff that has been proven, and the people that are in it are very serious and very educated, and that's just one area. But the neurosciences are looking at, how does the mind work? What is the interaction between the conscious mind and the subconscious? And you have to understand that we're talking about different aspects of one entity. It's not like I can cut out a piece of your brain and say, here's the conscious mind. We're talking about an abstract part of ourselves, and there's a lot of serious research that is going into this, and it's way past the point where you can question it as being something that's foo-foo. It isn't really science, but yes, it is science, and that's really indisputable at this point.
Yeah, Tom. I mean, you also, for people that don't know, do a lot of coaching. You coach the team at One Huddle. You coach private patients, athletes. You have done it for a number of years.
Yeah, over 20.
What do you feel you spend the majority of your time talking about when you're talking to the segment of that group that's concerned with performance, whether it's an athlete or an organization or a team like One Huddle? Where do you find that you spend the majority of your time today?
It's always in the beginning. In the beginning, the very first thing that people have to understand is that they are not their thoughts. And I tell them, look, I am not my thoughts. I have some thoughts, and those thoughts I create. But most of the thoughts, and as neuroscience is about 95% of the thoughts that we have are just programs that we have installed unintentionally. It's not always intentionally, unintentionally into our subconscious. And so when the stimulus happens around us in front of our eyes, or we hear things, somebody walks in the room and it's a trigger, the subconscious just says, what is the response to this? And it goes and plays that off. Now, you can't get control of that. You can't be the thinker of the thought until you begin to reference yourself outside of that loop and you become the observer of the thoughts. And that you have to get through some, what I'll call thought awareness training. You have to do some sort of a meditation, which I teach, and you only need about 10 minutes a day. We're not looking for some sort of an experience. What we're looking for is an awareness that your mind thinks without your permission. And you can't change what it's thinking if you're in the thought, and which is where most people spend their day. So that to me is where I always start, and you spend the most time, because that's the key to the prison door. Once you get outside of that loop, now you have the privilege of noticing what your mind is doing and making a conscious, creative choice to change it.
Which, given the amount of technology on our person today, has I guess the adoption of like mobile technology and multiple screens and has that made this, the adoption of this type of science, maybe has it sped up in your opinion? Do you feel like the pain that maybe some of the new technologies that have been released have set a environment where the type of science you talk about that's been around for a long time is more likely to get adopted now? Like, why didn't you write this book 20 years ago?
Well, I didn't know what I know 20 years ago, for one. But I would say it's really interesting because in some ways it's at odds with the technology today. Because the technology today, the constant exposure to screen time is speeding the brain up. Because what we're doing is we're asking the brain to process more information in the same amount of time. And the brain is complying with that. But what we are losing, which is an important aspect of our cognitive abilities, is our ability to reel the mind in and focus on one particular thing for any length of time. That's why people are finding it harder and harder to read books. And I have seen, I see people that, even to sit still, for 10 minutes just to do the meditation is a struggle for them, because their mind is always in motion and their mind is always processing data and analyzing data, and that's one of the reasons why they're so fatigued at the end of the day. Their mind is being pulled in a lot of directions, so it's very hard for them to be in one place at one time, where their feet are, if you want to say it that way. And so from that perspective, the technology almost needs to be counterbalanced with this technology here, because this technology is understanding how we work. The media and the screen time is really, in many ways, is working against that. And that's why I tell people, you have to balance this thing that we are asking our brains to process at, run at a higher pace. You have to balance that with something that continues to maintain the faculty of focus and the ability to focus, because in your job you have to focus. There's times where you have to think about one thing for one thing at a time for a length of time, and you will lose that if you don't work on the faculty.
Yeah, and again, I just think about the fact that we live in a world now where the majority of workers are frontline workers. The majority of those workers are, unfortunately, low-wage workers who are bringing to work all types of thoughts before they have to think about how they react to a guest or a customer who comes in. And again, as I reflect on the book, I just think that the tools that either you're sharing or the tools you're challenging your reader to consider that you may not even be sharing, but the ideas of creating systems to be more deliberate about thinking is so urgent and so important.
Yeah, deliberate. I'm very firm on the deliberate thinking, because so much of our thinking is not deliberate. We're not even part of the decisions of what thoughts we're going to have. We just have the thoughts. I ask people many times if when you feel yourself stressed or anxious or pressed for time, if you could stop that thought, would you? And of course they say yes. And I said, so you're not the thought's happening to you. And so you exist outside of that thought. And most people, you can't change what you're not aware of. And so you have to get in a place where you're aware that you aren't the thought, you're the observer of the thought. And when you do that, what happens is you not only disconnect from the thought, but you disconnect from the emotional content of the thought, which is very handy, at times in situations, because it frees you up to make better decisions. It frees you up to not feel the anxiety. It frees you up to just be more where you are, doing what you're doing, and to feel good about it.
What's your next book?
The next book, I think, is really going to deal more with the quantum physics element, and it's going to be talking about where our thoughts go after we have them. After we have the thoughts and the thoughts create the emotion, then where do they go? And then how does that impact us? How does that impact our life? How does it impact the company?
I think stuff's super important, super relevant. Last question for you. We'll see if it changed from the last time we spoke a few years ago. Even from when we spoke the first time, we've gone from a great resignation moment, to everybody's quitting, to we can't find workers because the market's tight, to now we're in a moment where there's a lot of organizations during COVID who said that they were going to stand by their workers or were letting them go and peeling back out of fear of recession. So the labor market's gone through its ups and downs during that time. What's your hope for the future of work?
Well, if I was completely honest, I would say my hope would be that they model themselves after One Huddle, because I feel that working with One Huddle, as I have now for quite a while, and I've gotten to know everybody here from the CEO down. It's a healing environment that is. And as I work with the people, they love their job, they want to come, they want to perform, and they're willing to try different things to perform at a higher level because it's what they want to do. And I can tell you that as someone who has worked with many different companies, it's an unusual environment, and it's an environment that really needs to be adopted across the board. If we're going to, if we're going to save people, everybody has to work. Almost everybody has to work, and they spend so much time so much of their life in work. It should be something they want to do. It should be someplace they want to go. And because how they're feeling during the day is impacting their mental health, the health of their family, is because they bring all that stuff home. And so I do think that, what my hope would be is that the managers, HR, all these places step back and realize, squeezing blood out of a stone, it's just an old technology and it doesn't work. And that's one of the reasons why so many people, once they got a taste of not having to go to work, didn't want to go to work anymore, because they felt like the physicality of not having the pressure of the workroom and the manager hanging over them and all these different things that would happen. They don't have to be that way, but because it was that way for so long, as soon as they got the opportunity to experience what it would be like to not be there, they were like, I don't want to go back to that. I don't want to go back to that. And so, but it doesn't have to be that way. There are options. And as I said, what One Huddle is offering its employees, to me, is really the model that should be followed.
Appreciate that. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, great to be here.
I think there's a ton of relevant takeaways that Tom's talking about, not just in Practicing Mind, but in his latest book, It's Just a Thought. This concept of you're not your thoughts, the concept that tech today interferes with the state of being present and being where you are in any moment. I mean, there's a ton of relevance here for leaders and for our workforce, and that there is a performance mode and there is a learning mode, and that what Tom said about how leaders often make the wrong decision around what mode they're in or what they're coaching in at any moment. Giving your people the freedom to be in learning mode in tough situations as they're skilling up or acquiring new experiences is really critical. I want to close with this one excerpt from It's Just a Thought. A trap we can all fall into is the addiction of having more. Tom goes on to say, what is your definition of perfection? Tom goes on to say, I think everyone experiences a sense of incompleteness, one that we become aware of in contemplative moments. As leaders, it's our responsibility to create environments where our people bring their best to work every day. That doesn't just mean the skills that relate to the specific job. It means the identity and the dignity that they have in the work that they perform. And you know what? They may not be perfect. And you know what? They may not be complete. But it's our responsibility as workforce leaders to create the right environment for our people. And this is what was one of the biggest messages I took away from Tom Sterner, this concept that we need to be okay with the learning mode. We need to be aware that when we're feeling certain things, they are just a thought, and we are ultimately not our thoughts, but in control of them. I don't think there's any more important concept to wrap our heads around as leaders, especially in heavy frontline workforces where workers are taking on so much more than they ever had with so much less than they ever had. So if you haven't already, go on over to your local bookstore. If they don't have it, tell them to order it. Tell them to order a bunch of it. Pick up Tom Sterner's latest book, It's Just a Thought, Emotional Freedom Through Deliberate Thinking. Now don't forget to subscribe to Bring It In so you never miss an episode. We've got some awesome guests lined up that you're not going to want to miss. Now, back to work.